Much like the rest of the NFL, the Detroit Lions have until Tuesday to make their final roster cuts. But before we get to that, I decided to make my own 53-man roster prediction, and we're going to go through that list right now. What's going on, Lions fans? Welcome to the Pride of Detroit YouTube channel. I'm Meko, and in today's video, you heard correctly, I'm going to be making my very own 53-man Lions roster prediction. Now, let's keep in mind that this list is purely for fun. I'm not giving any type of inside information. I'm just trying to guess, just like the rest of you, what players I believe are going to make this roster. And I think this one thing that I want to point out before we get started into this list is point out that I made this list based off what I think the Lions will do. So I took my own personal feelings out. I tried to put my feelings about certain players to the side and just focused on, what tendencies do the Lions have? What have we seen them do in the past at certain positions? And what do I think is most likely? So, with that said, please don't get mad at me if I said that your favorite player got cut or if I made a controversial pick in your opinion. There's going to be plenty of that. Also, it's worth keeping in mind as I go through this roster breakdown, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the starters. There may be a position here or there that I may talk about the starters in depth, but for the most part, we're going to try to focus on those controversial picks that I made or the difficult decisions that I had to make when putting this roster together. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the list. All right, guys, so we're going to kickstart this roster breakdown and this roster prediction with the offensive side of the football first. And of course, we're going to have to start with the quarterback position. So let's get started with Jared Goff as the starter for your Detroit Lions. Obviously, this isn't a surprise to anybody. It should not shock anybody. The thing that probably will shock people is the fact that I kept Nate Sudfeld on this roster. And I know a lot of people have been asking for Nate to be gone since Teddy basically got here. The problem, though, with that is through two preseason games, while Nate hasn't looked amazing, neither has Teddy. And Teddy's only been here for one. And so we'll have to see how he looks in the Carolina game. Yes, I am filming this roster prediction before the Lions play the Carolina Panthers. But as of right now, I could definitely see a scenario where the Lions decide to keep three quarterbacks. We know how they went into this offseason and made that proposal to potentially keep their three quarterbacks in the event of emergency situations. And with the way the Lions roster will currently be built, they could technically afford to keep a third quarterback at least for a couple weeks and then decide to cut Nate Sudfeld later in the season to be able to make any other type of roster move. I don't know, like for example, if JMO decided to come back and you had one too many wide receivers. Currently, that's just how I have things shaking up. I still think Teddy Bridgewater would be the first primary backup to Jared Goff. But like I said, Teddy hasn't looked fantastic throughout camp to this point, and having Nate Sudfeld as an emergency, especially going into this Chiefs game, at least you know Nate has a firm grasp of the playbook as of right now. Yes, we will have to question whether or not he has the skills and abilities to play at a high level, but Teddy just hasn't looked like he's fully grasped the offense and fully built the chemistry necessary for me to feel confident in him having to play week one in the event that Jared Goff went down with an injury. And so, for that sake alone, is why I'm going to go with three quarterbacks as of right now. Also, it's worth calling out that I do have Hendon Hooker listed here. Obviously, he's not going to be available for the Lions because he's still going to be on the NFI list as he recovers from that ACL tear that he had while he was in college. Now, Dave Burkett did report earlier this week that the Lions do plan on activating Hendon at some point in time in the season. And if they decide to do that, it goes back to the point I was making that, you know what, if the Lions did decide to want to move on from Nate Sudfeld, they would have an option to do so, but they could also activate Hendon Hooker, which would once again put them back up at that three quarterback count. Now, let's move on to the running back position. And this was one that, again, I went against my heart and decided to go with what I think the Lions would actually do. Because as you can see, I decided to keep a fullback in Jason Kabinda. And personally, no, this is not the decision I would make, but I do believe that the Lions value what Jason Kabinda brings from a special teams capability. They're not overly concerned of what he's doing at the fullback position because in most situations, more when he's being utilized, he's probably going to be out there for blocking. And so if he drops a pass here or there, for them, it's probably not going to be the end of the world. For you and I, yeah, we might pull out the rest of our hair, but That goes beyond the point. Jason Kabinda is a guy that they trust very much so on special teams, and he's able to play that position at a very high level. And that is where the bulk of his value comes in. What he does at fullback is just an added bonus. Now, above Jason Kabinda, we have the RB3 position, and this was another position that was somewhat highly debated at various points throughout the offseason. And it's mainly due to the fact that Craig Reynolds did struggle with some injuries here and there. And so there was some questions about could the RB3 door be open? And once Justin Jackson retired, the door became even more open. But for me personally, I always felt that Craig Reynolds had a strong hold of this position. And so far through the one preseason game that we've seen and just kind of how the other running backs have looked to this point, I would still have to give Craig the edge in this RB3 battle. Now, the only person that, again, like I said, I'm recording this before the Carolina Panthers game. The only person that could possibly challenge Craig at this point is the likes of Jamar Jefferson. And if Jamar can have a really good game today, then it's very possible that he could leapfrog Craig Reynolds and, take the RB3 spot for himself. But as of right now, I got four running backs or three running backs and one fullback making the Detroit Lions roster. All right, so now we got to move on to the offensive line. And as you can see, I have the Lions keeping 8 offensive linemen. And this was actually pretty easy once I just kept it to 8. Obviously, you have your 5 starters in Taylor Decker, Jonah Jackson, Frank Ragnow, and Panay Sewell. And for me, I went with Halapoli Vati as the right guard. And I get it that Vaitai has been in a camp battle with Graham Glasgow. And listen, this is one that really could end up being a coin flip. I could really see the Lions going either way between Vaitai and Glasgow and who could eventually get this starting spot. But for me personally, I'm going to go with Vaitai. And the deciding factor in my decision to go with Big V over the likes of Graham was something that I heard in another training camp observation that was highlighting the fact that Panay Sewell just looked to be more comfortable and seemed to play at a higher level when Vaitai was next to him. Now, if a reporter is able to pick up on that, it's very likely that the coaching staff also was picking up on that same vibe. And when it comes down to an offensive line, one of the biggest things that you hear preached as far as offensive lines being successful is cohesion and all of those guys being on the same page. So if having Halapoli Vatai in the starting lineup is the thing that's going to help Panay play at his best, you can almost best believe that the Lions are going to go in that direction. Now, moving on to the role players, that's where I got into some what you would have thought would have been tough decisions. But once I started looking at it, it was fairly easy for me to figure out which offensive lineman I would like to have on the Lions as far as in reserve roles. First, we got to start with Jermaine Ifedi. If anybody has watched any of the videos I've done over the last couple weeks, you know that I'm pretty high on Jermaine Ifedi and the play that he's put out there at both left and right tackle. He shows the ability to bounce back and forth and still not have a huge drop off in his capabilities. And so that's something that at least makes me feel confident in the likes that Taylor Decker or Panay Sewell went down. In the likes that Taylor going down, you could easily slide Panay over to left, and Ifedi could come in and play right. And if something happened at right tackle where Panay had to miss a couple games, you still feel comfortable with Ifedi going in and playing that right tackle position as well. Next, we have the rookie Kobe Sorsdal, who has basically been repping with the second team throughout training camp at that right guard position. And while I don't think he would get the nod over the likes of Graham if Halapoli Vati were to go down, I still like the fact of Kobe making this roster and showcasing that you know what he has the versatility to play on both sides of the offensive line, as well as right tackle if it became like an emergency situation. I also would be interested to see if the Lions might be interested in using him in a swing tackle role, much like they did with Matt Nelson when he was on the roster, who, as you can see, isn't going to make my cut. And then last but not least, we have Graham Glasgow. And Graham is kind of your do it all offensive lineman for the interior of that offensive line. He can play center and back up Frank. He can play right guard. He can even play left guard if asked. So if that's the situation, if that's how I'm kind of looking at this group, it's probably not the sexiest offensive line that you could possibly have, but it's a group that I would feel fairly confident in. Now, the only real thing to debate is if the Lions would decide to go with 9 offensive linemen instead of 8. And it's very possible. The only problem is I couldn't think of a ninth offensive lineman to justify giving a spot to. So with that said, this is the first half of the Lions offensive unit for me. All right, guys. So with the first half of the offense out of the way, let's now move on to the second part, which is basically just going to be tight ends and wide receivers. And between these two groups, there's only 2 spots that were really tough and had to be like really thought about for me. But let's start with the tight ends first. I got the Lions keeping 3 tight ends, and it's the 3 tight ends that you would expect. Sam Laporta as your starter, Brock Wright and James Mitchell as your backup guys. And I would expect all three of these tight ends to get some play throughout the season. It's just going to matter about packages and matchups and things of that nature. But Sam Laporta is going to be that guy who's going to be leading this tight end group. I expect him to lead in receiving yards. I expect him to lead them in touchdowns and in overall receptions. I just expect him to be that guy for this Lions offense. And it mainly has to do with how he's performed throughout training camp. And I think once we get into the regular season and things become even more lively, that connection that he's been formulating with Jared Goff is really going to start to find itself. But at the same time, you can't sleep on the likes of Brock Wright, who absolutely found success in this Lions offense last year and is still one of their better blockers. And the same could be said for James Mitchell, who has some very good athleticism and could be a really crazy nightmare for defenses, especially if Sam Laporta is on the field at the same time. Next, we have the Lions wide receivers. And there's no mistaking who the top four guys are for this Lions team, potentially even five if you were counting JMO, but clearly JMO's going to be dealing with a suspension. So the question becomes, what are the Lions going to do with the other remaining spots? And in this breakdown, I have the Lions going with six wide receivers, which is going to give them a great amount of flexibility once JMO's suspension is up. But the top of this group is pretty self-explanatory. You have Josh Reynolds, you have the do-it-all number one wide receiver for this team, Amon-Ra St. Brown. You have the veteran in Marvin Jones Jr. You have Mr. Underrated himself, Khalif Raymond, who will also be doing punt return duties for you. But then that's when you get to the next two spots. And those two spots are where we're probably going to have a discussion in the comment section because I know a lot of people are going to be screaming about Chase Cota not being on this list. And I get it. Chase has put up the numbers. He's definitely had the wow moments. But for me, I choose consistency over wow moments. And that's why I'm choosing to go with Antoine Green. I think Antoine Green has proven himself to be a consistent wide receiver in both the short, medium, and long passing game. At the same time, he's also went out there and played special teams at times as well. Not necessarily as a returner, because that's not what they've asked him to do, but as someone that can go out there and cover punts, or go out there and block for kick returns. Antoine Green has been showing that he's willing to do it all. And that is enough for me to put him on this roster over the likes of Chase Cota. And then you have Dylan Drummond, and Dylan Drummond has just been on a tear ever since the Lions decided to sign him following rookie minicamp. He's been doing nothing but kind of just proving himself and showcasing that he has the mental fortitude and the ability to hang with this team and to probably be someone that they could look to develop long term. The only knock on Dylan Drummond is that he probably hasn't looked nearly as good in preseason games as the reports coming out of training camp have been. But I'm going to give the slight edge to what he's been doing in training camp and the fact that the offense has not been very good in these preseason games, especially when you look at offensive line and just the struggling play of both quarterbacks. And as I mentioned earlier, you guys can see Jamison Williams listed. He obviously will not count against the roster once the season starts. Once he is off his suspension, the Lions are going to have to release somebody, and that could very well be one of these wide receivers, or they could choose to make a move at another position. But come week 7, JMO's going to be on this roster, and it's very possible that one of these receivers could find themselves on the practice squad or in a different city altogether. So, guys, that's going to do it for the offense. As you can see, by the number in the corner, that is 24 offensive players, which means the bulk of this roster, yeah, the bulk of this roster is on the defensive side. So let's go ahead and jump into that side of the roster and see what players are making the cut for me. All right, guys. So here we have the first half of the Lions defense. I'll have the second half, which is mostly the secondary and the specialist on that part of this roster breakdown. But listen, while the offense was fairly easy for me to kind of put together, the defense is pretty tough in every area because there's room for you to make cases for a number of different players on this defense. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go ahead and look at the defensive end slash Sam linebacker group for me. Now, I have the Lions keeping six guys at this position, and that's largely due to the fact that they seem to love to rotate their edges and they love to rotate their packages based off of opponents, and that they're not afraid to use a guy like Josh Paschal or John Kaminsky and put them at defensive tackle or put the likes of Charles Harris or even James Houston at a Sam linebacker role. But when you look at this roster, again, the top of it, I would say five of these spots are fairly common. It's probably who most people are expecting to make this roster. Where things got tricky and when things are going to get a little debated is the sixth spot. And I don't think it's a strong debate for or against James Houston because I think a lot of people felt that James was going to make this roster from the beginning and that he should have never been in a camp battle. And I get it. I get why you would feel that way considering the season that James had last year. But we always have to remember when every new season starts, these coaches are looking for players to progress and to get better. And if James found himself in a camp battle, it was because they felt that there was an area in his game that he still needed to improve in. However, the area that he needed to improve in was also an area that Julian Okwara needed to improve in as well. And so far through this offseason, I'm just going to give the edge to James Houston and say that I think he's done enough to at least keep a hold of that sixth edge spot. Now we move on to the defensive tackles. And again, much like the edge group, near the top, it's the guys that you would expect. It's Aleem McNeil and it's Isaiah Buggs. The next become the reserve guys. And who are the guys that are going to be rotating in with these players? So the first backup that I have is Levi Onwuzurike. Now, Levi is someone that very well could find himself off this roster if the Lions don't decide to keep five defensive tackles like I am. But in this scenario, I have them keeping five. And if they're going to keep five defensive tackles, I don't see how Levi doesn't make this roster. He's coming back off of his back injury and he's looked very well. He's very looked really healthy throughout camp. He hasn't missed any days because of that back injury. And going into preseason games, he hasn't found himself re-aggravating that injury either. And he's looked strong in those games as well. The next player that I have behind him is the player that he would be in a battle with. And I don't have a really strong argument to have against Benito Jones making this roster. I think Benito has had a really good preseason up to this point, and he's also had a really strong camp. And I think he's one of the reasons why it's not going to be easy for Levi to just walk onto this roster this year. Now, the last defensive tackle that I have making this roster for the Lions is Broderick Martin. And Broderick Martin is the third round pick that the Lions made this year. And while he definitely still has room to grow and develop his game, I still think he's done enough to make this roster and to be able to play alongside these veterans and to learn from them while he's on the job. Martin may not see as many snaps as some of these other rookies on this Lions team, but he'll get his fair share when he's out there giving Isaiah Buggs a breather or giving the likes of Aleem McNeil a breather and just manning the middle, specifically probably on rundown situations. But again, he'll have that opportunity for his game to grow as the season progresses. And last but not least, we have the linebacker group. And what I did with this group probably isn't realistic. This is probably, again, me. I probably gave into my heart on this one, guys. All right. I'll be completely honest. I probably gave into my heart on this one, but it's hard for me to imagine that the Lions won't want to get Jack Campbell on the field. And so that's kind of why I have both him and Derek Barnes listed as Mike linebackers, both Mike 1A and Mike 1B. I don't know in what situation and how frequently it happens in the NFL that teams rotate their Mike linebackers, but I think Jack Campbell has done enough to earn himself opportunities to play on this defense and to get some meaningful snaps throughout the regular season that I just wouldn't be surprised if the Lions did decide to rotate him and D Barnes out on very specific play styles or on downs and distances where they decide to go with Jack over the likes of Derek Barnes. I'm willing to admit I might be overthinking this one. Derek Barnes has definitely done enough to continue to be the starting Mike linebacker for this Lions team going into Kansas City. But I also think that Jack has done enough to also earn that right as well. And so it's going to be really interesting come Tuesday when we find out what the Lions have decided to do and what the depth chart may look like going into that first game against the Chiefs. The rest of the linebacker group is as you would expect. You have Alex Anzalone being your starting will linebacker. You have Malcolm Rodriguez being that backup, and he'll probably play a lot on special teams. And then I went with Jalen Reeves Maven. And again, Reeves Maven is probably in a battle with Anthony Pittman as far as like, hey, who was the better special teams ace? And if that's the case, Germ is going to win that every time for me. That was what he made his bread and butter on, even when he was here in Detroit. He did it really well when he went to Houston, and he's continued to do that really well once he's gotten back to the Lions. And so I don't expect that to change. Again, there's a lot of position groups on this team that you could argue maybe they keep one more or one less at this position. The linebacker group for me is one that seems pretty set. I think the Lions will absolutely go with five. I would be shocked if they went with any less, and I'd be very shocked if they went with any more at this point. All right, guys, we're coming down the final stretch of this roster prediction, and that's going to be the secondary and the specialists. So, let's not waste any time. Let's jump right into the corners. I think at the top, it's fairly simple as who you would expect to be your starters at both the outside positions and at the nickel. On the outside corners, you have Cam Sutton, the newly signed free agent from the Pittsburgh Steelers. You have Jerry Jacobs, and then you have highly touted rookie Brian Branch manning the nickel spot for me. Now, again, the Lions could absolutely throw us a curveball here and still choose to line up CJ GJ at nickel. But as of how things have been progressing throughout camp and how many snaps and how much, Brian Branch has impressed not just the coaching staff, but seems to have left a pretty good impression on the fans as well with his play in preseason. Only one preseason game worth mentioning. I still can't see a scenario where Brian Branch isn't starting and where he isn't getting a high rep count. He just has done too much, in my opinion. He shows that the moment's not too big for him. He shows that he has the intelligence to play the position. So I don't see a scenario where Brian Branch isn't out there with the rest of these veterans. With that said, the backups are pretty much who you would expect. Will Harris is someone that's going to make this team, whether you like it or I like it. It just is what it is. The Lions trust him and they believe that he has a role that he executes the way that they expect him to execute it. I can sit here and say that tape says differently, but that's not for me and you to decide. I'm basically saying that I believe that the Lions will choose to keep Will Harris going into the regular season, and he will be that guy that backs up Brian Branch, as well as potentially backs up any of the other corners because he does have that versatility to play just about anywhere in that secondary. Now, the next two picks, much like the wide receiver spot, now, the next two picks, much like the wide receiver spot, is where there can probably be a little bit of debate because I'm going with the likes of Starling Thomas and Stephen Gilmore. And really, I don't know if there's too much to argue with Starling Thomas. Yes, he hasn't always been the greatest in coverage, but what the Lions may ask of Starling Thomas to do from a special team standpoint, and I have him listed as the kick returner, may be enough for him to make this roster. We know that he may also be the guy that's up first in terms of being a gunner for the punt team. So there's a lot of opportunity for Starling Thomas to still make an impact on this roster outside of some of the other corners that the Lions could choose from. And then there's Stephen Gilmore. And Stephen Gilmore is the one that might be highly debated the most because there's guys like Khalil Dorsey, there's guys like Chase Lucas who could very well leapfrog Stephen Gilmore and make this roster, but for me personally, looking at what this UDFA has done to this point, I just think he's done enough to make this roster and be someone that the Lions would love to retain and develop for the long term. And when I say that, what I'm basically saying is I believe that if the Lions were to cut Stephen Gilmore, that he will not pass waivers and he will not get to their practice squad. However, I think if they're able to retain him, they could develop him and he could turn out to be a very good corner for them in the near future. Now, much like Hendon Hooker with the quarterbacks, you can see Emmanuel Mosley is listed here as a player that's on the pup list, as he is still also recovering from his ACL injury. And there's a strong likelihood that Emmanuel will be activated at some point in the season. And once that decision is made, again, you have a couple UDFAs on this roster that you might be able to make a move for and let go of so that you can get Emmanuel up onto this roster. But we'll have to see when that is and what decisions the Lions decide to make room for the likes of Emmanuel Mosley. Now we're on to the safeties. And again, the safety group is another one that's very easy, especially because I only kept it to four players. And when you're looking at that, you basically have two starters, you have two backups. And with the two starters being CJ Gardner Johnson and Kirby Joseph, I think you're going to get amazing safety play throughout the regular season, but you still have a really strong, capable backup in Tracy Walker. And Tracy's basically falling to the backup position, not because of any faults of his own, but really just because I think Brian Branch has just been that impressive as a rookie. But even with having Tracy and the likes of having Ifatu Melifonwu as backup safeties, that's a really good tandem to have in the event that something were to happen to either of your starters. And last but not least, we have our specialists. Now, it's a no-brainer that Jack Fox and Scott Daly will be your punter and long snapper. Neither of those players had competition, or at least Scott Daly's competition didn't stay in Detroit long. And so those two positions are locked away. Next, you have your kicker battle. And I've been pretty much saying it since he landed back in Detroit. This was Riley Patterson's job to lose, and I still believe that to be the case. And I don't think he's given up any amount of ground in this kicking battle against Parker Romo. Honestly, I don't really think there's anything that Parker Romo could technically do to leapfrog Riley Patterson at this point. And like I said, I'm recording this video before they play the Panthers. And so, short of Parker Romo going out in the Panthers game and knocking through consistent or consecutive, 60-yard field goals, I still think the Lions are going to go with the reliability and the consistency that they know that they have in Riley Patterson. It kind of felt that way the minute they traded for him. It definitely felt that way the minute they let go of Michael Badgley after retaining Riley Patterson. And so for me, it's easily Riley Patterson. All right, guys, that's going to do it. You had 24 players on offense, you had 26 players on defense, plus your three specialists. You do all that math, that gives you 53 players for this Lions roster. Again, like I said, this is just my list. This is just my prediction. This is what I think the Lions will do. Your list might look different. Your prediction might be different as well. If so, please let me know in the comment section below. Let me know who you would keep. Let me know who you would let go of. Did you have to make any tough decisions when you came up with your 53-man roster prediction? I would love to know and love to discuss it with you because I'm gonna tell you right now, some of these decisions were really easy. Some of them not so much. And I think there's a lot of tough decisions coming the Lions' way as Final Cut Day quickly approaches. But if you are looking for any more Lions content, if you're looking for the roster prediction that Jeremy and Eric typically put together, or if you're just looking for more roster news on the Lions, please be sure to head over to prideofdetroit.com. You will find all the information you need, inside coverage, and all types of articles about the Lions over on that website. Also, if you are new to this channel, if you've never watched a video from Pride of Detroit before, first of all, thank you for checking us out. Also, be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. That way you can be notified anytime we upload a brand new video. Again, everybody, I'm Miko. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.